Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this week's lecture. With only a couple of weeks left, we will take some time to talk about social relationships and their relationship to your overall sense of well being this week. It's a great time to take a look at some of the connections that you have to others, especially which ones are meaningful and why you value them. With regards to your quiz, you know the drill. Be sure to study both the lecture and the book in order to be most successful. All right, so let's get started. So here's today's outline. It's pretty simple and straightforward, so let's take our time and let these concepts sink in. We'll review the connections between social wellness and your health and quality of life. Usually, the first thing that people think of when they consider this connection is the difference between introverts and extroverts. So, we'll spend time talking about that distinction and how social wellness might change for each type. Now, we might still have images of these strong mountain men who don't value social relationships and go it alone. So we'll take a look at a model that explains the different types of attitudes we can have towards these social connections and what research says lies beneath them. And that's going to lead us into a talk about our role in these relationships and how we can identify in dealing with relationships that we find to be toxic. That's going to give us a simple yet well rounded overview of what social wellness consists of and what you can do to improve upon it. Does that sound good? All right, let's move on. So here's today's outline. It's pretty simple and straightforward, so let's take our time and let these concepts sink in. We'll review the connections between social wellness and your health and quality of life. Usually, the first thing that people think of when they consider this connection is the difference between introverts and extroverts. So, we'll spend time talking about that distinction and how social wellness might change for each type. Now, we might still have images of these strong mountain men who don't value social relationships and go it alone. So we'll take a look at a model that explains the different types of attitudes we can have towards these social connections and what research says lies beneath them. And that's going to lead us into a talk about our role in these relationships and how we can identify in dealing with relationships that we find to be toxic. That's going to give us a simple yet well rounded overview of what social wellness consists of and what you can do to improve upon it. Does that sound good? All right, let's move on. The first question that might come up is, does social wellness really matter? After all, we don't physically need to have meaningful relationships in our lives in order to survive day to day, right? Well, that's kind of flawed logic. Think back to when we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Certainly, we don't need others to meet our more basic physiological needs, such as food or shelter, but the higher we get on the hierarchy, the more important those needs become. You can also think about the evolution of humans and society. At one point, society was, in fact, necessary for us to meet those basic needs, and living in a community allowed certain citizens to hunt while others gathered, and still others created different goods or services for the common benefit. Evolution doesn't move that quickly, and that means we still have this innate need for social contact. Even today, we need others in order to learn how to speak. Maybe they need to teach us how to use tools or any other skill. Without others, we would be left to discover and invent all of these things on our own. So it's widely accepted that social connections are a universal need for all individuals. And when we accept that these social connections exist for everybody, we can start to think about what those relationships are. And so, for the purpose of this class, we're going to label these interactions that we have with others, focusing on both good, bad, and neutral relationships. Keep in mind that our lectures on cognition and emotional regulation, on your attitude, focusing specifically on how you might choose to respond to somebody, can greatly shape your nature of the relationship that you have with them. And that's just another example of how all these different domains are interrelated, and the growth in one certainly affects their growth in others. One of the easiest ways social wellness can influence your direct quality of life is through the concept of social capital that we've discussed before. This can include people helping you with certain projects or addressing different concerns, as well as maybe helping you identify different opportunities and helping you network with other important individuals. Now, the absence of positive social connections or the presence of negative relationships can certainly negatively impact your health. Remember, the result of many different poor lifestyle behaviors is from being overly stressed. So, someone might not make you physically ill, but the stress from that negative relationship or the lack of any positive relationship will certainly stress your system. For instance, consider being in isolation and how it's a huge form of punishment in our society. One of the harshest punishments you can receive is putting an inmate in solitary confinement. We're subjecting them to a form of punishment that's especially harsh. You can think about how prisoners suffer from the lack of contact, and so why wouldn't the rest of us? Now, our examples might not be as extreme, but maybe you could think about when you've been ignored by certain other individuals and how that kind of ate away at you, or maybe it was annoying or frustrating, and so on some level it did affect you. Now, of course, being thrown in solitary confinement is extreme, but it helps us illustrate the impact of a lack of contact. So let's put this into a broader lens. One famous study found that men, on average, only have one close friend with whom they feel they can share openly. Other studies have found that it's through those social relationships that young women have historically shown aggression, right? I think we referred to it in psychology as relational aggression. It might not be hard for us to think of the negative social relationships that we have with others, and when you see the different people with whom you have a negative relationship, whether it's at work, in class, or wherever, we have some sort of negative feeling. We also talked about how wellness isn't just about removing the negatives, but adding the positives. If you think back to the continuum, we might just be moving towards the neutral point if we simply remove the negatives. We need to be proactive and work our way up the continuum to a more high level functioning. So we can't just eliminate negative social connections, nor we can be satisfied with a heavily restricted social sphere. We have to intentionally do things to create strong, positive social connections. Now, to be clear, we aren't saying that everyone needs to be extroverted. There's still a difference between being introverted and extroverted. To think about the differences, consider where you go to rest or to re energize when you're tired. Introverts are more likely to go and seek more solo activities that are quiet, maybe even with a small group of people or an intimate group of friends. That's opposed to an extrovert who may be energized by getting out and being with a large group of people, say at a party or like a popular spot downtown. The energy from the crowd invigorates the extrovert and helps them recharge. Another distinction that you can make could be in the form of how individuals process information. Many introverts are internal processors, choosing to think on their own with regards to a given topic, opposed to extroverts who are more likely to process a line of thought by talking it out with others. They process those thoughts externally. No matter these distinctions, it's important to keep in mind that people are not completely introverted or extroverted. No one is all of one and none of the other. Introverts can often find themselves enjoying events in larger crowds or processing externally, and extroverts still find it nice to sit quietly from time to time or to spend time with fewer amounts of people, etc. These differences are only in preference. Both are personality types, and no matter where someone falls on that spectrum, they still need a sense of social connection. The only thing that changes is what that social engagement will look like. We all have to take a moment to think about what types of relationships are meaningful to us and then pursue those. So, when you hear the words positive relationship, who do you think of? For the sake of this lecture, just hang on to the first person that popped into your mind. Consider what that person does or what it is about that relationship that makes it a positive experience. Is there something that you'd like to do for them? Do you take the time to intentionally decide to do something nice for that person? For instance, saying, you know what, I'm going to do blank for this person today. Now, you can think of a less favorable social relationship. Maybe try to consider what's that negative relationship looks like or what that person might have done. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I always encourage my clients to be fair in their judgment of others. A good rule of thumb is that when you're thinking of something that someone else might have done wrong, for instance, think of two things that you might have been able to do differently yourself. For instance, if you have a fight with someone you're close with and you find something that they did wrong, Can you find two things that you could have done differently? That engages your cognitive and emotional sides to help balance out a bad situation. Now let that sink in and consider what roles you play in your relationships. Too often we get caught up in simply evaluating whether or not we want to be friends with someone, but we don't take into account our own actions. Social wellness is being aware of the whole relationship, everything included, and intentionally creating positive experiences. What thoughts you were having while you reviewed this, for instance? Is there something you'd like to do for somebody now that we've talked about it? So let's come back to this idea of no social connection. Here's a nice quote on your slide. We talked about a lack of social relationships as a negative, even a punishment for criminals. But this is a different kind of idea than just experiencing loneliness. We don't necessarily have to be alone to feel lonely. We could be in a crowded room with friendly faces everywhere and still feel a sense of loneliness. Loneliness refers to this dissatisfaction within our social connections and the distress that we're going to feel when we don't have those connections that are satisfying. For instance, there's a major difference between sitting quietly on a relaxing beach and being stranded on a deserted island. One of these would be much more distressing and come with overwhelming feelings of loneliness, and the other is much more positive. Thinking about our relationships holistically can help us put ourselves in a situation to combat loneliness. We can start seeing how our actions might impact our social connections, for better or for worse. And it's an idea that's meant to empower us to be actively involved in shaping our relationships, rather than simply waiting for a positive relationship to randomly cross our path. A great example of this would be a fight you might have had with a significant other or a good friend. Even when you weren't near the person anymore, or actively talking to them, it was probably still hard to take your mind off them or that argument. You think about what you wish you would have said or the things you might say in the future. Think of how much mental energy dwelling on that fight might have consumed. People might find fault in the other person or spend time thinking about the things they wish they would have done differently. It's an example of loneliness or dissatisfaction with a social connection and the powerful mental and emotional aspects that play a part. Now, the opposite is true when you spark a new relationship. This can be the positive feelings that we have from meeting someone with similar interests. Maybe the excitement for some cool activity you're going to do with this group, or how excited you get when you find somebody that you connect with romantically. The thoughts and feelings that we have surrounding these social connections are some of the strongest in the human experience. So let's think more about the opposite of loneliness and what it really means to belong. So belonging is much more than just, having some sort of big group hug. Sometimes we have a temporary encounter with others that makes us feel great. Then, when we're alone, we start to feel a sense of loneliness again. Belonging is simply feeling that you're worthy of love or belonging. How powerful is that? It doesn't have to necessarily be physically present. It's the fact that you feel that you belong or you feel a sense of connectedness, even when it's not necessarily present. And you might be able to think of that when you talk or reflect on the person that you thought of when we talked about a positive social relationship. Even when that person's not around, you might feel that connection, and that connection gives you a sense of belonging. And so if you think about it, maybe you can think of a time when you were shy. And often this might have been because you weren't really sure if others were going to like you or approve of something you were going to say or do. We're doubting whether or not we're even worthy of their acceptance. Can you think of another time where you're really happy or confident in a group of people? You were probably worried far less about whether or not you're going to be accepted. That preoccupation about whether or not you're worthy, especially of that acceptance, is what eats away at us emotionally and can take away a great deal of time. It can add stress and it can really negatively impact our overall sense of well being. So, for instance, we need to spend more time focusing on that sense of worthiness, right? And we have to fight conditional beliefs. Those conditional beliefs will say, I'll be worthy of love or belonging when dot 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 happens. Or I'll be happy with myself when dot 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 happens. Those things are going to really eat away at who we are and our well being. So some people think of this as a hard time, and maybe they have a hard time believing that they belong to something. So instead of focusing on it from such a conditional perspective, we can take like this sentence here, and I'll explain it shortly, and fill in our own ending, right? So when I say this, think of the second half of your sentence. You can tell yourself, I deserve love and belonging because dot dot dot. All right, and that doesn't ask whether or not you have this sense. It assumes you have it, and you simply just have to identify the connection or identify the reasons why. So hopefully that was clear. If not, feel free to take some time, reread the quotes on this slide, maybe replay some of the things I might have said before moving on. We can do another quick exercise here with this table to figure out what your needs are socially. So take a look at it, see what's at the top here. Across the top, we're talking about the model of the self, and whether you have certain levels of self-anxiety compared to the levels across the side here, was your expectations or models of others and your levels of avoidance. So if you take a moment and you look at this, individuals who have low levels of anxiety and positive views of others are considered to be secure in their relationships. Others who have low levels of anxiety but really negative views about others tend to be more dismissive and just try to avoid other people. Now, high levels of anxiety about yourself and positive views of others tend to be preoccupied individuals. So these are the ones that are really worried about what other people think. And they might really respect or hold others in high regard, but are really worried about what those other people think of themselves or how they're being judged. And then lastly, you can have individuals with high levels of personal anxiety and still a strong negative view of others. And these individuals are going to be very distressed or maybe even fearful of other individuals. If you'd like, feel free to pause this here and read over the descriptions and reflect on how each of these might, tie in with how you felt in different situations at different times. But for now, we'll go ahead and move on. Now, we've already talked about how this is a great time to work on several different areas of wellness in the past, but college is an unprecedented time for exploration, self discovery, career development, and personal relationships, especially when you're talking about some of these social or career connections that you might have for the future. We've already talked about social capital a few times, and you can also maybe even think about other individuals who you know have gone through college and understand that maybe you've even heard them say that they've met some of their lifelong friends through this experience. So, not knowing who you are means you might haphazardly go through college and develop some of these relationships based on chance or luck. And so, we talked about career wellness before and how you can't be afraid to have a negative experience in order to figure out what your ideal career will look like. And that might happen with social relationships too. You might not really know what an ideal social relationship is until you have one that's less than ideal. And we'll talk more about toxic relationships in a minute. But through all this, you can develop a greater understanding of who you are and what you need from people in order to make those connections meaningful. And you can also learn to express that to people who are important to you. It doesn't mean you have to get it right the first time. It's almost inevitable that you're going to meet someone that you don't agree with and things won't work out. Uh, but always take an opportunity to be aware of yourself and identify these different aspects of good, bad, or neutral relationships. Now, one of the reasons this is even more important in college is because we have a tendency to silo ourselves and really insulate ourselves from other groups of people. For instance, if you're studying psychology, you might be surrounded by people who also are interested in psychology, but you might not be surrounded by anybody who's interested in biology or engineering or chemicals, this or that. And so college brings together all these different people with all these different beliefs, and it's such a great time for us to exchange those with one another that we can take advantage of it now before we end up in a professional setting where, again, we might be in a silo and everybody has a very singular firm of what they believe in or what they appreciate. So be open to communicating with people who don't agree with you, and be willing to, let those negative encounters, exist, but also to avoid them as best you can. It's a weird balance between accepting viewpoints that you don't agree with, as well as managing or maybe terminating relationships that go beyond simple disagreements into a certain level of toxicity. Now, being able to take control over your sense of social connectedness can lead to a sort of a spiraling or a cyclical sense of self-fulfilling prophecies. For instance, a common reference in our society is recognizing that those that act jealous or angry towards others are oftentimes harboring those same feelings within themselves, and that what they end up just projecting those onto others. Yet another is a misconception that doing certain things will please others and we can make them appreciate us or like us. So let's take an example from childhood. This is something I've used with clients. When you were a kid, you might have thought that your parent or sibling was in a bad mood. And when you thought that they were in a bad mood, you started acting differently to avoid upsetting that person. Now, when you started acting differently, that person might not have noticed, but maybe they did, and now they're starting to get a little confused by the change in your behavior. Over a period of time, the way you act around that person starts to annoy them or irritate them, and all of a sudden they are upset, even though they weren't before. Another popular example would be when someone starts asking you repeatedly whether or not you're angry. Why are you so mad? Why are you so mad? Why are you so mad? Even if someone isn't upset, being asked repetitively eventually leads them to become irritated, confirming the suspicion that they were upset, even though it wasn't true in the beginning. So, how can we make these ideas work in a positive direction? We can intentionally find the best in someone else's behavior and point it out. By pointing out things that others do well, research suggests that that person is going to feel good about that recognition and they're going to choose to do more of it. It also helps us understand what does make other people happy. That might apply to a romantic relationship when someone says, I really appreciate you doing this for me today. Well, now their partner knows if I do more of that, it'll increase positive feelings. It's simple as pointing out something that they've done and just recognizing it that makes an impact. So, has somebody recognized something that you've done for them? More than just saying thanks, because we say thanks all the time. Did they express a more sincere form of gratitude? Did it make you feel good to hear about what you had done and how it was appreciated? I bet those positive feelings led to more kind acts. It might take a little more mental effort to go beyond saying just thanks to include a more thoughtful response, but once you make it a habit to say those things, you're going to create an environment of positive connections around yourself. The first step might be recognizing that people are almost always doing something positive. It's just on us to notice it and recognize it and then thank them for it. Now, a majority of the time, people are doing positive things, or at least they're meaning to do something positive. It's rare to find people who are intentionally harmful, but it is possible. So, how do we deal with relationships that are intentionally harmful? Does it mean you have to stop being such a kind source of positive connections? Do you have to start being more mean and bitter? I'd say no, but let's talk some more about these toxic relationships. Our textbook refers to them as toxic, and when I think of toxic, I think of someone who is sick, and they've become sick because of their association with this negative person. For instance, we act differently around our grandparents than we do around our friends. And that might work and as well with a toxic person. Being around a toxic person might kind of rob us of our positivity or our positive connections. And that kind of makes us socially unwell or socially sick. Now, the book cites some research, and that research took advantage of some stereotypes and labeled these individuals that often form toxic relationships as either pit bulls or cobras. Again, those are stereotypes that they're using to illustrate a point. And the individuals that they're openly referring to are those that are threatening, and they're very clear about being threatening. They would label those individuals as pit bulls. Regardless, individuals are working to isolate us from others, including our families and friends. They're trying to sever those positive ties, whether they're openly aggressive or whether they're very sneaky and surprise us with their attacks, more like the cobra personality they mentioned. So not only does their toxicity poison our well-being, they're actively working to sever those positive connections, further pushing us into a place of social unwell or social sickness. So can you think of a time when you disagreed with a friend? It could have been some political debate or a topic about something less heated, like who's your favorite character on a TV show. Could you disagree with that person? Because a sign of a toxic relationship is that a disagreement becomes explosive and harmful to the relationship. That is one of the most potent ways to combat a toxic relationship is just to tell somebody else. If you can't disagree with that person, then maybe you need to start talking with other people. And talking to somebody else is what the book recommends we do. Namely, that your first stop is with the police. So remember that if you can't talk to the source of toxicity, you need to talk with someone else. And so, in a toxic relationship, the book is going to recommend talking to the police, and the police will be the ones to give you much more concrete advice. But what it's also going to drive you to do when you share with other people is to reconnect with your friends and family. And maybe you're telling them what had gone on in this toxic relationship or so forth, but essentially you're reestablishing positive connections, and that's going to help pull you out of the grips of that toxic relationship. And so it's going to pull you from being socially sick back to a place of social wellness, all right, and where you're going to be much more socially resilient and have a stronger sense of belonging. Now, a majority of the time, people are doing positive things, or at least they're meaning to do something positive. It's rare to find people who are intentionally harmful, but it is possible. So, how do we deal with relationships that are intentionally harmful? Does it mean you have to stop being such a kind source of positive connections? Do you have to start being more mean and bitter? I'd say no, but let's talk some more about these toxic relationships. Our textbook refers to them as toxic, and when I think of toxic, I think of someone who is sick, and they've become sick because of their association with this negative person. For instance, we act differently around our grandparents than we do around our friends. And that might work and as well with a toxic person. Being around a toxic person might kind of rob us of our positivity or our positive connections. And that kind of makes us socially unwell or socially sick. Now, the book cites some research, and that research took advantage of some stereotypes and labeled these individuals that often form toxic relationships as either pit bulls or cobras. Again, those are stereotypes that they're using to illustrate a point. And the individuals that they're openly referring to are those that are threatening, and they're very clear about being threatening. They would label those individuals as pit bulls. Regardless, individuals are working to isolate us from others, including our families and friends. They're trying to sever those positive ties, whether they're openly aggressive or whether they're very sneaky and surprise us with their attacks, more like the cobra personality they mentioned. So not only does their toxicity poison our well-being, they're actively working to sever those positive connections, further pushing us into a place of social unwell or social sickness. So can you think of a time when you disagreed with a friend? It could have been some political debate or a topic about something less heated, like who's your favorite character on a TV show. Could you disagree with that person? Because a sign of a toxic relationship is that a disagreement becomes explosive and harmful to the relationship. That is one of the most potent ways to combat a toxic relationship is just to tell somebody else. If you can't disagree with that person, then maybe you need to start talking with other people, and talking to somebody else is what the book recommends we do. Namely, that your first stop is with the police. So remember that if you can't talk to the source of toxicity, you need to talk with someone else. And so in a toxic relationship, the book is going to recommend talking to the police, and the police will be the ones to give you much more concrete advice. But what it's also going to drive you to do when you share with other people is to reconnect with your friends and family. And maybe you're telling them what had gone on in this toxic relationship or so forth, but essentially you're reestablishing positive connections, and that's going to help pull you out of the grips of that toxic relationship. And so it's going to pull you from being socially sick back to a place of social wellness, all right, and where you're going to be much more socially resilient and have a stronger sense of belonging. All right, so my challenge to you would be to intentionally create positive connections with those around you. Be a source of positivity and let that create self fulfilling prophecies like the ones we discussed earlier. One of the excellent ways you can start practicing this is just simply to volunteer your time. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to take a few hours to go to a church or a local organization. You can simply volunteer to stop and connect with somebody. That's a volunteering, kind of like a donation of your time. It can even be even smaller. Doing something little for someone else, like opening a door, helping somebody carry some bags, or troubleshoot a problem, can go a long way in creating a strong, positive social connection with others. You can think of that movement with regards to random acts of kindness and how doing something nice for others is contagious, and that other person might end up passing it on and spreading the kindness to even more individuals. So, of course, you don't necessarily have to volunteer to serve groups. You can simply engage with other people. You can volunteer to donate your time. Having a positive and pleasant conversation can boost someone's spirits and give them a rush of positive feelings that can stick with them for the rest of the day. One way to do this is to spread a little humor or cheer or brighten others' spirits, and that's something the book talks about a little bit more. Now, one of my last recommendations is focusing on the best in everyone. This ties back into the self-fulfilling prophecy. Those who expect the worst in others usually find something wrong, leading them to be more positive or pessimistic, more negative, and in general, less pleasant to be around overall. Instead, try to find the positive in everybody. Perhaps a person did something strange, but they probably had very good intentions. Switching the way you cognitively evaluate others can change your emotions about the person and stop a negative cycle. I always say that if I hear somebody negatively evaluating someone else, it's likely that they might be negatively evaluating me as well when I'm not around. So maybe you can find the best and show others that you're one of those individuals that's going to be a source of positivity, giving people credit for the positives and creating a more positive cycle of thoughts, emotions, and social wellness. Now, as usual, I try to tie in as many Ohio State resources as I can, and there's no exception here with social well being. There's an incredible amount of free support for students in this domain. Namely, there's over 1,000 different student organizations that students can search for and get involved with. And if you're interested in learning more about these groups, feel free to retype this link in your browser and check out what OSU has to offer. And that's it. Hopefully, we gave you some excellent information here about the details of strong social well being and social connections. Whether or not you think you're introverted or extroverted, take some time to think about how these apply to you. If you're looking to really make a difference in your personal social wellness, consider taking uh, our personal wellness challenge for the week. Consider giving someone forgiveness, maybe intentionally doing something nice, or just focusing on strengthening a given social relationship that you have. Others might choose to focus more on themselves and understand what their own needs are, which is just as great because that'll impact every connection that you have, knowing exactly what you need or what is good or bad for you in those relationships. Maybe you can even take a chance on a new relationship and maybe find something good in someone new and include them in some of the different things you're doing. No matter what you choose to do, I hope this information finds its place in making a meaningful impact on your future wellness. So, with that being said, I hope you're well, have a good day, and best of luck on your quiz.